Sean Kelly, the President of the Indo Australian Association, Dr. Susan Parthandam, Office Bearers of the Association, Dr. Amanda Day, Education Counsellor at the Australian High Commission in Delhi, previous recipients of this award, Distinguished Award, Dr. Elizabeth Verghese, Dr. Vinod Daniel, Mr. Tareen, and anyone else who I'm not being able to recognize. And Mr. Sean Kelly, is it? Sorry, I haven't pointed out. But I am completely overwhelmed by this honor, not just because of the company that I am in, of the previous recipients, including probably one of the greatest fast bowlers in the history of cricket, Dennis Lillee, but also others who have made huge public contributions, performed great public service. Dr. Elizabeth Verghese is a pioneer educationist. The Hindustan Group of Institutions is a role model in many ways for how private sector can intervene without compromising on quality in higher education. Vinod Daniel has done remarkable work in preserving the heritage in Australia. He and I have done projects which can never be disclosed for reasons of discretion, but I can only say that I today went to Kanjivaram to buy saris for my daughters, and we stopped at Sri Perembadur, but that'll give you a hint of the kind of projects that we did. But his work, even with the Eye Institute, is remarkable. The way in which medical care, state-of-the-art eye, ophthalmological medical care is being provided to less privileged communities and people is exemplary. Again, Mr. Tareen, his work as Trade Commissioner and as a way of binding the two countries together is well known, so well known that it doesn't need any repetition. I would also like to acknowledge the presence here of my two colleagues from the Australia-India Institute, Dr. Malika Joseph and Mr. Vinod Mirchandani, and acknowledge the presence of all the other distinguished guests. And ladies and gentlemen, as I said, it is an honor to be here in Chennai, because Chennai quite clearly has a special connection, not just through this institution, but a special connection with Australia, has always had a special connection. It's a cliche when they say that Chennai is closer to Perth than Sydney is to Shanghai, but in that cliche is embedded a body of understanding and knowledge that we are still trying to recover, the kind of many connections that existed between Chennai and Australia, including the fact that for a long time the Honorary Consul General of India in Melbourne was from Chennai, and who was also a previous recipient of this award, Dr. Jana Rao. So I would like to celebrate through my award this wonderful city and how much it has contribution, not just to the cultural capital of India, but also the close connections that it has developed with Australia. We are, ladies and gentlemen, at a fascinating moment in our history, particularly in our bilateral history. Never before, I state that and emphasize that, have we had the opportunity to build a relationship which could become one of the most important relationships of our region. And the reason is clear, because there are few countries in the Indo-Pacific, call it what you will, which have so much in common by way of values and interests. You can often have values in common, and yet as realists in international relations would say that without a common bonding of interests, values will take you this far and not further. But when you have a convergence of both values and interests, then the sky is the limit. And this is not always the fact. If you look at the history of our bilateral relations, you can see a history of suspicion, mistrust, even antagonism. For a long time, we neither had the common values nor common interests. Since the beginning of the Federation of Australia, Australia adopted a White Australia policy, which alienated generations of Indians from what they thought or believed was essentially a racist policy. It was during the 50s and early 60s, and finally with the emergence of the great but controversial Gough Whitlam, that policy was dismantled. But even for those years that it existed, there was a sense of deep mistrust between these two countries, aggravated by the fact that the leadership of the two countries did not often get along. The two longest serving prime ministers of India and Australia had deep contempt for each other, Robert Menzies and Jawaharlal Nehru. I mean, I can say this as a historian, Sean Kant as a diplomat. But Menzies and Nehru never got along. Menzies was prime minister for nearly 18 to 20 years. Nehru was prime minister for 17 years. So that period, you had a wide gulf in the leadership, a wide gulf in values. On top of it, we were on different sides of the Cold War. Australia was firmly within the Anglo bloc. They saw themselves then as part of the Anglosphere. And they saw, perhaps, as John Foster Dulles, the Secretary of the Secretary of the United States, often said, that non-alignment was immoral, that sitting on the fence and not taking a position in favor of the West or in favor of NATO, the NATO bloc led by the United States, was immoral. But Nehru believed, wisely so I think, that at a stage at which India had got independence, it was important for it not to get entrapped in the Cold War rivalry. And that a weak country, as we were then, economically, politically, could exercise greater leverage, not through its economic and military power, but through the power of its ideas. This trajectory more or less continued till the end of the Cold War. I mean, you had moments when Mrs. Gandhi visited Australia, but even the narrative of Mrs. Gandhi's visit, it just tells you, there's very little known about that visit. The only university she visited was La Trobe University, and there's very few people who can answer why did she decide at La Trobe. La Trobe is a partner university of the Australia-India Institute. It's a fantastic university, which later on had a great India studies program, but why La Trobe? And she seemed to have got very little high-level attention at that stage. There was a brief moment again when Rajiv Gandhi and his counterpart got along for a while, and then, of course, Rajiv Gandhi lost the elections, and that moment was lost. So frankly speaking, till 1990, we had a growing convergence of values, but few interests to bind us. Till 1990, if you recall, India was following an autarkic economic policies, which were essentially socialist-driven, inward-looking, not interested in liberalization, leave alone globalization. But all that changed in 1990. The Cold War ended, non-alignment seemed to become irrelevant. India was almost bankrupt and had to, under strict IMF policies, adopt a policy of liberalization, internal competition, and global openings. And also the fact that Australia began to see itself much more as an Asian power rather than as a part of the Anglosphere. But we launched a policy paper, a task force report, and that described the 90s as really as a lost decade. That despite the fact that all this had changed, you had very little bandwidth, very little connectivity, and still remnants of the old misunderstandings. To the point that when India tested its nuclear weapons, the strongest reaction came not from those who controlled the pillars of the nuclear non-proliferation regime, but from Australia. Australia's reaction to the 98 nuclear tests put our relationship almost in cold storage for another few years. But that has all changed. And that is why this is one of the most fascinating moments in our bilateral history. 2014, to give you an example, will go in the history of bilateral relations as perhaps arguably the most important year. For 28 years, no Indian Prime Minister had visited Australia after Rajiv Gandhi's brief honeymoon with Bob Hawke. In 2014, you had Mr. Abbott, the Prime Minister of Australia, visit India in September, and a reciprocal visit by Prime Minister Modi within months in November. And I was a witness to both visits, and I have really seen so much camaraderie, not just in terms of personal chemistry, but also in terms of a recognition of the potential of this relationship. There might be tactical differences on issues like WTO negotiations or climate change, but frankly speaking, at the moment, there's not one issue which is what, in the parlance of international relations, zero sum, which means the gain of Australia could be the loss of India or vice versa. There's not one single issue on which there is a major difference of opinion. Whether it's strategic, both countries want a certain sense of balance in this region. We do not believe that the rise of hegemonic power would be in the interest of the safety, security, and stability of the region. Or it's a wider canvas of different issues. If you look at the memorandum, the joint communique signed by Abbott and Modi in September, the 36 paragraphs, and each one of those paragraphs, whether it's skills or cybersecurity or counter-terrorism or trauma management, or you can count from, or energy, clean energy, or to mining, it's a range of issues, which is a range of issues which really spreads across social, economic, strategic boundaries. Therefore, associations like this one are much more needed. Because while governments can set the agenda, bureaucracies with the degree of political push and momentum can translate that agenda partially into reality. It's ultimately the civil society of both countries which have to ensure that this relationship is much more robust, that it does not get derailed through single incidents. Remember, recall, in 2010, and that was perhaps the last year of the lost decade, you had a magazine like Outlook rather cover, and Vinod will remember that, because of the few student attacks on Indian students in Melbourne. Why do they hate us? There was a cover story in Outlook magazine, and basically suggesting that Australians had a racist attitude towards India. This was still part of the old White Australia policy. But things, as I said, have changed and transformed, but they can only move forward with the support of organizations like yours, Dr. Susan, and all the other stakeholders who are in this room today. Interestingly, the second Prime Minister of the Australian Federation was Alfred Deakin. And Alfred Deakin was also in the Australia-India Institute of Delhi. We have a bust of Deakin. And people say, why Deakin? Why not Whitlam? Or why not any other Prime Minister? Deakin was one of the first people to actually visit India and write a series of articles for the Age on the irrigation system of India. But he also wrote a book on Hindu temples and customs, and then set up in what is now the commercial business district of Melbourne, the Theosophical Society of Australia. He became a committed theosophist. Now, you might say, although one of my plans this time was to revisit the Theosophical Society on the banks of the river Adyar here, but you might say, oh, he was such an eccentric cult follower of Madame Blavatsky and Charles Leadbeater and then Jiddu Krishnamurti and others. The fact remains that in those connections, however marginal, eccentric, or trivial they might seem, you can build a relationship. When Jiddu Krishnamurti, the great philosopher who set up the Krishnamurti Foundation and who was initially recognized by this Theosophical Society and the Order of the East as the second Messiah, a role which he discounted and gave up. When he visited Sydney, there were hundreds and thousands of people in the 1930s waiting to greet him. Now, Jiddu Krishnamurti, again, some people may not agree with his view, although I think his views on education are as relevant now as they were then. But again, individual civil societies, the power of ideas can move much more, can do much more than governments can often do. So first of all, finally, of course, thank you so much for honoring me. And as I said, it's really an honor I'm humbled about, overwhelmed about, but have great pride in accepting. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I request Mr. Ashok Varghese, Director of Hindustan Group of Institutions, to present Mr. Amitabh Mattoo.
Did I not stand for elections as well? After a while,